Welcome. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Jasleen Coley, and I direct the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA School of Law. This is our second in our Critical Race Studies book series that we have for the 2020-2021 year. We will have a couple more in the spring semester of 2021. But it is my honor to introduce today's session, where we have our own CRS faculty member, Tendayi Achiume, in conversation with Natsu Taylor Saito. So I'm just going to introduce Tendayi briefly, because if I were to give her a proper introduction, I know that I would be taking up a lot of our but Tendayi is a professor of law here at UCLA, and she has been with us since 2014. She is the former faculty director of the UCLA Law Promise Institute for Human Rights. And in November 2017, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed her as the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, making her the first woman to serve in this role since its creation in 1993. She is also a research associate with the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand, and her current focus of her work is the global governance of racism and xenophobia and the legal and ethical implications of colonialism for contemporary international migration. More generally, her research and teaching interests lie in international human rights law, international refugee law, international migration, and property. So before I turn it over to her, just to let you know, we are taking questions through our Q&A, so you can leave questions there for us. And thank you for joining the conversation.
Hey, Jasleen, thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome to all of you who are joining us from wherever you're joining from. I can't tell you how excited I am for this conversation with Natsu, and let me turn off my email, otherwise it's going to continue to make those noises. Okay. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. And so I'm going to give our speaker today an introduction and then just dive into Q&A. And the way we've set up the format is that I will begin with some questions for Natsu and then turn it over to all of you for your questions as well. As Jasleen mentioned, please use the Q&A function. So it's really a profound privilege for me to introduce our author today, who's Natsu Taylor Saito. And she's an activist attorney and a distinguished university professor at Georgia State University College of Law in Atlanta, where she has taught courses on international law, human rights, racial justice, and others since 1994. Her scholarship focuses on questions of race, citizenship, and the rights of Indigenous peoples, national security and political repression, and international human rights remedies for racial justice, race-based injustices. Natsu's latest book is Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists, and that's the book we're going to be discussing today, and it was published by NYU Press in March of this year. But she's also the author of Meeting the Enemy, American Exceptionalism and International Law, which was published by NYU Press in 2010, and also of From Chinese Exclusion to Guantanamo Bay, Plenary Power and the Prerogative State, which was published by the University of Colorado in 2006. And she's published way more law reviews than I have time to even lay out here. As a former community organizer, Natsu continues to work on behalf of political prisoners and is involved in efforts to defend Indigenous rights, contest police misconduct, and protect academic freedom. So her work goes far beyond just the academic work that we will be discussing here, but really has her working as an activist attorney as well. I know Natsu's work in many different contexts, and I have to say one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be able to host this is that her work has just been so profoundly inspirational for my own work, both as an academic and also in my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur. In addition to her work on racial discrimination, she's among the leading scholars nationally and internationally who've really done a lot to theorize xenophobia from a legal perspective. And so before I was in this role, even my predecessor as Special Rapporteur published a report, for example, on xenophobic discrimination, and it benefited significantly from Natsu's input. As I mentioned, her work still remains informative in the work that I do today. And, you know, in addition to just being such an insightful mind, she's such a generous and inspiring mind and heart as well. And so it's really a pleasure to be able to host her in this wonderful conversation that we're going to have. So Natsu's latest book, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, or Why Structural Racism Persists, as I mentioned, was published this year. And I have a copy here. It is really a must read for anyone who's interested in racial justice, and decolonization as well. And it's a must read for people who are interested not just in US law or international law, but about the relationship between both bodies of law as they relate to racial justice and decolonization. And one of the things that is powerful about the book is that it's really speaking across multiple silos. So it's speaking to an audience that is focused on settler colonial theory and practice. It's speaking to an audience that is focused on racial justice in the legal perspective. And it's also speaking to both domestic and international legal levels as well. And so I think the book is a powerful intervention in terms of opening up a conversation among different siloed groups in really productive and responsible ways. So for those of you who have not yet read the book, I really encourage you to purchase it and to get a copy for yourselves. And hopefully the conversation that we'll have this afternoon will encourage you further to do that. So Natsu, I'm not going to take very much more time introducing you. That could take forever. And I want to begin by thanking you for being willing to join us in this format. And start off by having you talk a little bit about the motivation for the book before we get deep into its substance. And I ask just because you've written about racial justice, you've written about xenophobic discrimination and xenophobia, and you've written about both themes from different perspectives. And so I'm curious to know what motivated this particular book, given everything else that you might have been writing about.
Well, thank you, Tendayi. And before I get started, I just want to say thank you to UCLA's Critical Race Studies program for hosting not just this series, but all the amazing work you all do and the conceptual and as well as physical space you create for this kind of work. I also want to say thank you to Jasleen and the CRS staff, and especially Tendayi for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Atlanta, which is Muscogee Creek land, and that I think it's always important just to remember really where we are and our relationship physically to the land that we're on. I think that helps keep us grounded in a way that is very literal as well as figurative. So it took me a long time to write this book, like 10 years. Luckily, I had very patient editors. And when I started out, I was thinking about the fact that when we looked around us, realistically, racial justice was not, we weren't seeing improvements with respect to racial justice. Derek Bell talks about the importance of racial realism and acknowledging what's really happening around us. And I really think that that's an important perspective to have, to really be willing to be honest, to look around and to say, you know, in the 50, 60, 70 years since the civil rights movement, things overall have not gotten better for people of color in this country. In certain respects, they have. And with respect to a lot of individuals, they have. But statistically, we're not that much better off in terms of the disparities and the injustices, and as we all know, the violence against people of color. And that's been true over time, regardless of changes in the law and changes in leadership. I think that statement probably meets with less resistance today than it would have 5 years ago. But it's been really true. And so I was thinking about, you know, why? What are the structural forces that perpetuate racial domination and subordination, and really feeling a need to look more deeply into those. And at the same time, I felt really bad for young people who were having to confront and are still having to confront these really quite grim realities without the collective energy and vision that inspired us in my generation, and I'm old, right? But in the 60s and 70s, there was this energy to the struggle that we could look around and see that there was all kinds of injustice around us, but there was hope and energy. And I realized in thinking about that, that a lot of that came from the fact that we were in what's now often called the decolonization era. And we can criticize that with respect to whether or not decolonization actually occurred globally. But nonetheless, it was an era in which the world around us was changing so dramatically. We were looking at wars for independence all around us, and they were being successful. And movements for decolonization across Africa and Asia, anything seemed possible at that point. And here in the US, a lot of the most influential movements of people of color, the American Indian movement, the Chicano Brown Berets, the Puerto Rican Independentistas, the Black Panther Party, and many others saw themselves as national liberation movements. And so I was thinking about whether our understanding at the time that we were part of a global struggle for decolonization and our characterization of people of color in the United States as being internally colonized was wrong. Like, why did we stop talking like that? Why did we stop understanding ourselves that way and start to talk within a sort of equal protection framework? And as I thought about it, that was what really prompted me to look into the question of colonialism and internal colonialism in the United States. And as I looked more deeply into it, I decided that we weren't wrong. I think we stopped talking in terms of internal colonialism, partly because the movements that did that were violently politically repressed. And so it was seen as somewhat dangerous to take that position, especially for academics who wanted to stay safe. But also, I think it was because the way we were envisioning decolonization at the time, it was in terms of sort of classic external colonialism, where European colonial powers went to countries in Africa or Asia and exploited them and then went home. And that was a model that only worked so far with respect to the United States because the colonizers here came to stay. And so it only worked as an analogy. But that doesn't mean that we weren't and aren't still colonized. It just means that it was a different kind of colonization. And so when I realized that we were talking about settler colonialism, all of a sudden a whole lot of things started to make sense to me. And I realized belatedly that we did have people in our movements, Stokely Carmichael quite notably, and Jay Sakai and some other people who did talk about settler colonialism in the United States and had very cogent analyses that are still really useful, but that otherwise, we didn't often talk in those frameworks, with the exception, a huge exception, of a lot of Indigenous scholars and activists, of course, and just regular folks who have never stopped understanding the ongoing colonization of this continent. But I just thought that, it was so helpful that we needed to start a conversation about using that as a lens to try to understand what was going on around us. And I really don't think that I have, laid out any really, definitive analysis here at all. I'm really just trying to start a conversation looking at it from that perspective, because I think it opens up potential that we otherwise don't have.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And, I want to come back to movements, racial justice movements, and I'll come back to talking about the moment that we're in and how different it is from the moment when you were writing the book and how that might shape some of the insights that you have or that you had when you were writing the book. But it's very helpful to hear you give us that background and to also relate what ends up being in the analysis in the book to previous movements to try and connect racial justice to decolonization, both within the US and then externally as well. And the central thrust of the book, or the central argument of the book, really is, I think, what you're beginning to describe in your answer, which is that racial justice is a decolonial project. And you explore that in the context very much of a settler colonial frame. Could you share with the audience exactly what that means? What does it mean to talk about racial justice as a decolonial project, and what are the implications of that?
I think that racial justice has to be a decolonial project because the origins of racial repression and its current structural drivers, to use a term you have introduced with respect to xenophobia, are really based in ongoing colonial relations. And so my belief is that unless we are willing to look at the relationship of racial justice to the motivations that permeate colonial structures, we're not going to be able to actually change them. So with respect to origins, it really goes back to where did our understanding of race and races come from? And that's, of course, a large topic, and lots of folks have addressed it. But I think it's, just to summarize, it's fairly clear to say that the way in which people have been racialized is very particularly related to the functions that racism and racial hierarchy are intended to serve. And so in the United States, we have these very bizarre racial definitions where if you're going to be classified as white, you can only be of exclusively European origin, whereas we have had and still largely continue to have sort of the one drop rule with respect to people of African ancestry. We have American Indians being subjected to like 88 different federal definitions of what it means to be Indian, but pretty much they all come down to, has some white person said that you were Indian? And these classifications don't make any sense unless you look at them from a structural perspective. If you think about the fact that there was a desire to limit the number of white people because that's who was benefiting from the privileges of colonialism and exploitation and appropriation in this country, but they wanted to have a large population of enslaved people to do the labor from which they were profiting, then it makes sense that people who were classified as Black would be an increasingly inclusive category. It makes sense that if you wanted to eliminate Indigenous people so that you could claim their land, you would have definitions that were increasingly restrictive, and we get the flood quantum requirements, et cetera, for Indigenous peoples. So if you think about the purposes that are being served by racialization, what John Powell said about race being best understood as a verb rather than a noun really makes sense. And I think we can see that people have been raced to facilitate the settler colonial project, and that racism has then been mobilized to provide the justifications or the excuses for the horrors that have attended colonization. So if you look at those purposes of the settlers, so in a settler colonial state, as I said earlier, you have the colonizers coming not just to exploit and profit from the lands and resources and peoples that they are colonizing, but to stay. And that means that they want land. They have to have a base. So territory is the first imperative of a settler colonial state. And that means that they perceived a need to eliminate Indigenous peoples. And this happened physically, very much, through massacres and the intentional and sometimes unintentional infliction of disease, but also conceptually, right? It's amazing to me how often people still talk about American Indians in the past tense today. And so it is that move to eliminate the Indigenous peoples of this land, although it was not entirely successful, had a huge impact. And that could only be justified by the colonizers if they characterized American Indians as irrational, roaming, wild savages, et cetera, et cetera. We're all familiar with those stereotypes. Those stereotypes served very important purposes because they allowed the colonizers to engage in the kind of actions that they did, which they otherwise couldn't justify to themselves or to anybody else. Now, they knew, as well as everybody else, that by and large these were absolutely false. But nonetheless, they used those images to justify their actions. And those are the images that still permeate our society today. And the same thing, of course, is true with respect to people of African descent, right? They were very similar in many ways, but also somewhat different because the objective of racialization with respect to people of African descent was to portray them as essentially beasts of burden, not having the same kind of feelings emotionally or physically as Europeans, stupid animals, those kinds of depictions. And again, we see that the racialization has allowed for those that kind of exploitation to continue through the centuries, long after the formal abolition of slavery. And laborers who then were wanted, especially as slavery was outlawed, there was really a move to get labor that was both readily available and cheap, but also disposable. And I think that that's in large measure why we have people from Mexico, other Central Americans, other Latinx folks, people from Asia, but especially in the early days, Chinese labor, being racialized in ways that would allow for their exploitation. They were hard workers, generally, but they were untrustworthy. They're often portrayed in terms of vermin or disease, and that allows for their expulsion, for rendering them disposable when it was convenient. And it also fed into the perpetually foreign stereotypes that we see and the ability to mobilize xenophobic tendencies against them. And obviously we see that now, right, with all of the anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Latin American and Mexican sentiment we see with respect to immigration today. So that's one big piece, right? The origins of racialization and the characterizations that still permeate this society. But I'd like to say one other thing, if you don't mind a long answer here.
No, absolutely.
And that's that it goes beyond overt racism of the sort that I've been describing to permeate the foundations of this society. And just to give you an example, Cheryl Harris, of course, explained quite famously how whiteness is property. And I think that building on that, we can go further to say that property itself, as we understand it in this society, relies upon whiteness. And it is that construction of property, and we could go to gender, we could go to other foundational concepts of society, and I think make similar analyses. But if we just stick with real property for a minute, it is the construction of real property in a racialized manner that allows for, or accounts for the fact that people who are indigenous are today the poorest demographic subgroup in the United States. It accounts for why their lands and resources can continue to be appropriated and, raped, essentially. And if we look at Johnson versus McIntosh, I think we see this pretty clearly. That, of course, is the case that apparently a lot of people study in property as the foundation of property law here. And might be the only law professor in the country who never took property. But nonetheless, I have read Johnson versus McIntosh. And there, Chief Justice John Marshall is trying to decide which of two white guys gets the property at issue. The one who got his title ultimately from the British Crown, or the one who got it ultimately from the American Indian person who was living on the land. And so, of course, the one who got it from the Crown wins, right? We know that going into this. But the rationale for it is really interesting, I think, because first of all, Justice Marshall mangles the doctrine of discovery to conclude that only the colonizers and not the indigenous peoples living on the land could hold title. And he does this by saying the doctrine of discovery says European powers agreed amongst themselves that whoever got there first would have the first right to negotiate with the inhabitants of the land. So, I mean, he's very clear about the actual construction of the doctrine. And the doctrine doesn't say that they automatically get the land. They say, you know, this is a non-compete agreement between colonial powers, essentially. But then he turns that completely upside down to say, well, because of the doctrine of discovery, the people who live there couldn't sell their land to whoever they wanted to. They could only sell it to the, quote, discovering power. And we all know that if you really own something, you can sell it. So that means they didn't really own it. Which, of course, is completely absurd because this was an agreement between the European powers. It had nothing to do with indigenous land rights or indigenous law. But that's what allows for the occupation of this continent. And when pushed, right, Justice Marshall was very smart. He knew that this didn't really make any sense. And he says, well, you know, why is this true? Fundamentally, we're deciding this way because, quote, conquest gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. So he's admitting that this is a power move, not a legal move. And yet, he goes on to say, but, you know, this might be justified by the character and habits of the people whose rights have been wrested from them. And so what are those character and habits? I think they're pretty well summed up by his colleague, Justice Johnson in Cherokee Nation, who says that the indigenous peoples here were wandering hordes held together only by ties of blood and habit, having neither laws or government beyond what's required in a savage state. Now, that means that the only, quote, legal justification for the occupation of the land was an entirely racialized description of the people. Now, Justice Marshall and Johnson and the other, you know, founding father types knew that this was inaccurate, right? They knew that indigenous peoples had extensive agriculture, they had villages, they had all kinds of, you know, accoutrement of what the colonizers called civilization. And yet they ignored this willfully to racialize the people in order to justify taking the land. And what that means, the way that argument is constructed, the argument upon which we still base control of land throughout what the United States claims as its boundaries, is that the land itself was not property when indigenous peoples lived here. It only became property after white people claimed it. And that's what I mean by it's racialized. Like the very notion of what's property and what's not is intrinsically racialized. And so once we start looking more deeply at the most foundational sort of constructs upon which our entire society is built, I think we see that you can't just say, oh, well, let's just be nice and treat everybody equally from now on, right? You have to dig really deep to understand the way in which all of these foundational structures are premised on racism.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Natsu. And, you know, one of the things that I appreciate about the book is kind of the synthetic project that it takes on, right? So you, as you were just saying, you have this very functional analysis of race where you talk about race and racialization as colonial projects. And you talk about different groups within the US, you talk about Indigenous peoples, you talk about African Americans, you talk about immigrants groups, and the different ways that their racialization was a project of settler colonialism. And you also do, I think, a really powerful job of bringing scholars who've written about slavery into conversation with scholars who've written about settler colonialism, I think, in really productive ways. And in your answer to my question on kind of how is racial justice a decolonial project, you focused right now on kind of the origin story, and I want to push you to kind of bring us into the present, and I'm going to ask a two-part question. So the first part of the question is then, does that then mean that decolonization is the racial justice project, right? So now I'm inverting things and saying, is this kind of a call to say to different groups who are thinking about racial justice in different contexts, whether it's in the context of, systemic racism in law enforcement, whether it's systemic racism in the kind of the immigration context, is the call here then to say that those projects must be decolonial in side by side with, say, struggles of Indigenous peoples to think about what it would mean to decolonize this country? And if so, what exactly does that mean? So that's a kind of more general question. Is decolonization the racial justice project we should be focusing on? And then a second part is maybe more specific and thinking about some of the contemporary ways in which racial justice and discourses and movements around racial justice have been thinking and advocating for this work. So when you were writing about the book, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, but your book kind of was published pre the uprisings that we witnessed over the summer and that are still going on in parts of the US and even outside of the US. And, in the uprising, the discourse around racial justice has definitely not been an equal protection discourse. It's about, a lot of it has been about abolition, it calls to defund the police. I'm curious to know whether to your mind those are consistent with, the same as, or related to decolonization. So thinking about the kind of more general and then asking you specifically to reflect on movements today and how racial justice movements today and how you situate them within this broader framework.
Those are great questions and big ones. I am very hesitant to say anything is that decolonization is the racial justice project, in the sense that I think it's problematic to take a position that says everybody should be struggling in a particular way. I think that decolonization is a process that takes many, many different forms, and that none of us can say what specifically is the most effective form, et cetera. And I think the same is true about racial justice in many respects. However, I do think it's fair to say, or at least I believe, that racial justice projects ultimately cannot succeed unless they are willing to acknowledge ongoing colonization. And that means respecting and defending Indigenous peoples' struggles on this continent. For the reasons that I just was sort of summarizing before, I think that foundationally we're not going to get to the heart of the structural drivers of racism in this country, like what is really motivating racism here. Because if we don't get to the motivations, we're not going to be able to stop the results. And the motivations are so deeply rooted in ongoing colonization that I think it is in everybody's interest who wants to contest racism to defend and support Indigenous people's struggles, and to acknowledge that we are on illegally occupied land, and to defend in any way we can Indigenous people's rights. And let me just put a little footnote in here. For some people that's easy, and they know what that means. For other people, often I encounter students, say, who just have no clue, right? Like, I don't know any Indians, what am I supposed to do? And yet, if you look around, there are struggles all the time in every part of the country, to stop pipelines or to protect sacred lands or whatever's going on. There's lots of struggles to do that with. That said, I think that we see them, because of the structural relationship, we see those, or we should be seeing those, not as helping somebody else, right? Or as even being allies, as folks talk about these days a lot, but as our own struggles, because they are the struggles that will liberate us all, I believe. That doesn't mean that lots of other things don't need to also be happening, and that there's not a lot of other ways in which racial justice can be furthered in a way that will be productive. And to me, the litmus test is whether the struggles that we're engaging in are struggles for a more equitable share of stolen goods, right? We want to be more like the colonizers, right? We want some of that white privilege. We want some of the wealth that comes from the occupied land and the exploited labor. That I do not believe is a liberatory struggle. But to the extent that we're doing things that empower people and communities to see things outside the box of settler colonial hegemony, then that can be a decolonial project, and that can be something that might otherwise seem quite small and trivial, or it can be something that can be very large and significant. And so the types of activities or movements or efforts that you described, like defund the police or prison abolition, I think those can definitely be decolonial struggles. They aren't necessarily, but they are to the extent that they are addressing structural issues. They're really looking at different ways to organize and structure institutions in this country. Like, how do we want our communities to be organized? Who do we want to be policing or ensuring the safety of people in the community? They've gone, in many ways to thinking about, hey, maybe we can provide our own healthcare. Maybe we can provide our own education. Maybe we can, look at all these various different social institutions. And those I think can be very empowering in a sort of decolonial way. And so those I think, really are pushing us in a direction that's really positive. But it also, sometimes things that aren't even that foundational, I think, can be seen as decolonial projects. It just depends on whether or not they are empowering people to come together and say, no, the state doesn't tell us every move that we make and what's acceptable and what's not. We think for ourselves. What do we need in our community? What do our people need? How are we going to get it? How are we going to provide it for ourselves? And I think a lot about, just for an example, about what Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, said about registering people to vote, and this seems like sort of a timely observation right now. He said he didn't think that voting would really bring about any kind of meaningful change. And yet he went to jail dozens of times defending the right of Black people in the rural South to register to vote. And he said essentially that it's because they were contesting their colonization. He said the act of registering to vote gives one a sense of being. The Black man who goes to register is saying to the white man, no. He's saying, you have said that I cannot vote. You have said that this is my place. You have contained me, and I am saying no to your containment. And to me, anything that says no to containment has the potential to be part of the struggle for decolonization.
And I keep thinking about the book and hearing you speak and feel really fortunate that I get to have the privilege of having read the book and then now talk to you about things that come out of it. And for those of you who are listening who haven't read the book, many of the things that Natsu is describing, she goes into much greater detail in the book. And so please do think about getting a copy for yourself. So, in your response, Natsu, I think a number of things come out that I think are really interesting. It's also the critique is a critique of the nation state in many ways, and of kind of statist ways of thinking about where remedies come from, and shifting us to thinking about other levels of belonging that might also generate kind of more equal ways of living together. But I want to maybe ask the questions I've been asking from a different perspective, because I think it does make a difference what is highlighted. One of the themes that you talk about in the book is the relationship between self-determination and equality. And self-determination is often explicitly stated as a goal of decolonization. It's definitely been a goal that's been stated more explicitly in racial justice movements in this country in the past, but isn't typically necessarily what is foregrounded. And it's difficult to think about racial justice without self-determination, or self-determination without racial justice. But I'm curious to know what difference you think it makes to foreground self-determination over equality as the kind of normative goal. And I don't know if I'm reading the book wrong to think that you're advocating for a more explicit centering of self-determination as a goal for racial justice movements. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that is really key here, because to me, the notion of self-determination really encompasses the positive side of decolonization. Right? When we talk about decolonization, we're often talking about deconstructing colonial impositions. And yet we need to be thinking about what we want to build, not just what we want to tear down. And to me, self-determination opens up that realm. I see two big problems with framing our struggles as being primarily about equality. Obviously, equality is important. I'm not saying it's not significant, and that we shouldn't struggle for equality. Of course, we have to do that. What I'm saying is that it's insufficient, and it's insufficient particularly in this society because it's built on the belief that this is fundamentally a democratic society, and that we have eliminated enough structural barriers that we now essentially have a level playing field. However, if you believe that we do have structural racism, then what equal protection, or sort of a struggle just to be treated equally within the current frameworks and institutions means is that we are freezing the status quo, and therefore continuing to replicate the structural racism that has us where we are. So that's one problem with it. But the other problem with it is, what is our end goal? Do we just want to be equal within a colonial society? And I don't. That's not what I want. And I don't think it's what a lot of people want. And so that takes us to the notion that, what does it mean to really think about the right to self-determination? And, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And as you know better than most of us, right, books and books and books have been written about what it means or doesn't mean. But I think that it means the right to decide collectively what kind of political, economic, social, legal structures we want to have governing us. And that can be accomplished in a whole variety of ways. It can, encompass things at a community level. It can encompass things at a much broader social level. It can be within the confines of states, but it doesn't have to be. Self-determination can mean a struggle for recognition as an independent state within the statist structure we have now at the international level, but I don't think it has to be that. I think that there's many different forms it can take. And what's important to me about self-determination is that a lot of people have pointed out that one of the primary problems with colonialism, and I think this really addresses the question of racial justice too, is that it's not just exploitation. Colonialism requires, to function efficiently, the elimination of people's identities, values, languages, histories, who they are as peoples. And for one thing, of course, that's genocidal. That's the definition of genocide, is acts intended to eliminate people, groups of people, as such, as groups. And Lemkin, who actually coined the term definition, said that genocide has two phases, right? One is the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and the second is the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. And so what we see is that that's foundational to colonialism. And you can't have colonial relationships in which people are allowed to be who they truly are as peoples. And to me, that's what self-determination is about. It's like, who are we as peoples? And again, that's a complicated thing. Not everybody has one clearly identified identity in that sense. But we also have to remember that this notion that I have to have an identity is a very Western colonial construct. In lots of societies over time, people have had multiple overlapping identities. People don't have to only see themselves in one small box. And so, we can start to think about who we are in relation to other people, who we are as peoples, what our histories are, how those overlap and relate, how we want to relate to other peoples. To me, self-determination opens up that whole world of thinking creatively and in a way that's really furthering humanity and the well-being of non-human nature as well. Not sure that answered your question, but
no, it does. And I think that the chapters that speak to self-determination also do a really wonderful job. So I am going to encourage people to start populating the Q&A with questions, and people have already started doing that. And I have a few more questions, but I'm going to start pulling some questions from the Q&A as they relate to some of the themes we're already discussing. So before I turn to some questions on international law, Akila Kinnison asks, particularly in the context of communities of African descent in the US, how does the settler colonial framework change the way that we look at remedies for racial injustice? And so this is kind of pushing on the remedial options that are kind of opened up by focusing on a settler colonial framework.
One of the things that's great about international law is that it does provide a much wider range of remedies than our domestic law does. And even though there are many problems with the international legal framework because it is so much controlled by states and in so many ways perpetuates colonial relations around the world, nonetheless, it helps us think about the ways in which we have bigger remedial options. And to me, that's part of why, if we think about ourselves as colonized, then we think about where we want to go is decolonization or exercising the right to self-determination. And that means that our remedies aren't just, I want not to be discriminated against, not to be, denied jobs, not to be subjected to violence at the hands of the police, those kinds of things, which of course are very important, but those are only what we need to survive. What we need to thrive goes to who do we want to be as communities. And to me, this is important for all of us, but it really has deep resonance for people of African descent in the United States because of the ways in which Afro-descendant people's cultures have been so overwritten by the national pattern of the oppressor, if you will. And thinking in terms of colonialism and self-determination, I think we can see that international law has this tremendous emphasis on human dignity. And that's obviously a really important dimension to this. The example that always comes to mind to me when I think about how central human dignity is to a broader remedial framework. I think about Michael Brown in Ferguson, right? And how his body was left in the street for all those hours. And, you know, we don't have remedies in our legal system that account for that. I mean, at most, you could maybe make an argument that that inflicted some kind of emotional distress on his parents and they should get some money. But that doesn't account for human dignity itself as being a right that is absolutely foundational to all other rights. You know, it lets us go much beyond all the constraints that we have in our domestic legal system about, you know, you have to prove intent in order to establish racial discrimination. It recognizes that disparities can be just as dangerous and disabling as negative personal feelings. It acknowledges that when there has been harm done, you have to actually try to repair the wrong. And, you know, in international law, we talk about, you know, restoring the status quo ante, right? And obviously that's not going to happen in any literal sense with respect to Afro-descendant peoples in the United States. But if we look at remedial actions in that sense, we have a recognition in international law that, you know, there is the first thing that's supposed to happen is restitution for the wrong. And then if that can't be you know, if that doesn't solve the problem, if that doesn't make the wrong right, then we can look at compensation. We can look at rehabilitation. We can look at satisfaction. We can look at guarantees of non-repetition. In all these ways, I think that, you know, a broader legal framework opens up the notion. It makes the notion of reparations just a no-brainer instead of something that's so controversial as we tend to look at it here. And so all of these things, you know, theoretically could occur without decolonization within the current status framework, but they're not going to. And they're not going to because if we really started applying that framework, we'd have to talk about the value of enslaved labor and the wealth that it contributed to this country that is still dictating hierarchies of race and class. We'd have to look at illegally occupied land. We'd have to look at so many foundational precepts that, you know, are incompatible with the current colonial regime.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Natsu. And you kind of responded to both the question that Akila asked and the one that I was going to ask. So that's very expertly done. I'm going to turn to more questions from our Q&A box. So Justin Hansford is on. Hi, Justin. He says he's loving this. And so he's asking a question about one of your chapters, chapter 6. And he asks, why is your chapter on emancipated African Americans also called Rights and Redundancy?
Ooh, wow, somebody who's actually looking at the book. It's because I felt the need to break up the material into looking at the period before and after the formal abolition of slavery, because we often think that that was sort of a sea change. And it was, of course, in many respects. But my point there was that even after the formal abolition of slavery, the 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process clause being applied to people of African descent in theory, that we had a period in which there was all these rights were gained, and yet we still saw the same patterns of oppression and exploitation being instituted or continued or reinstituted. And so during that period, I mean, ever since 1868, right, or 1866, we have seen measures put in place to continue the exploitation of people of African descent, to continue Black people's labor being essentially stolen in the form of convict labor, in the form of essentially serfdom on the land, in the form of poor wages. And then we see people being treated again as property, really. When they're not seen as useful, then they are warehoused in prisons. And all of these patterns, to me, were very redundant of what had come before. And to me, what accounted for those patterns and the continuation of the sort of cycles that had been set in place during the time of formal slavery, we see that they were accomplishing the same purpose in many respects, in terms of exploiting and enriching the settler class. So it's a very, to me, it's a very redundant history, and I wanted to make that really clear that we weren't freed, right, with emancipation.
Thanks, Natsu. So I'm going to move on to a question by Grace Carson, who says that it's a question that's related to one of the ones I asked earlier, but Indigenous-led organizations such as Red Nation have stated that both prison and police abolition and communism are essential aspects of decolonization and liberation of Indigenous peoples. How do you see these movements working together, and is there room for these movements to work together more closely to achieve racial justice and social justice more generally?
That question is saying those movements like the abolition movement and Indigenous movements, how those work together? Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that they all are countering the problems that we have in common, but that affect Indigenous communities often in very extreme ways, right? We don't always remember that, or a lot of people don't know that in certain age groups, American Indian and Alaska Native men have higher rates of being killed by the police than Black men. We don't remember the extraordinary poverty rates and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in this country. We don't remember the ongoing murders of Indigenous women and the incredible lack of attention being paid to crimes against them and sexual violence and assault and all of those issues that permeate all communities, that permeate all communities of color, that permeate all poor communities. But they are intensely felt in Indigenous communities, and a lot of the struggle in Indigenous communities are to address those problems. And I think that to the extent that we are trying to address those in non-Indigenous communities, they're not even parallels. They're the same struggles in many respects, right? I mean, some of the details are different in terms of who has jurisdiction where and things like that, but the dynamics are the same. And so I think that there's great opportunity there. And I think that the divergence comes sometimes when we look to how they're being framed. If they're being framed in terms of we just want to be treated equally, then at some point there's a divergence in where we're going with the struggles. But there doesn't need to be. We don't have to frame the struggles in other communities in terms of equal treatment. We can frame them easily in terms of fundamental structural change, which to me is a decolonial project, even if you don't use the word.
Mm-hmm. Another question here. So this one is on the long end, and the person apologizes. This is Remy Della Peza, but I think it's a great question, so no apology necessary. I'm going to read it to you, Natsu. Let me know if you need me to read it. Right. So Remy says, most of my work is focused on anti-gentrification efforts grounded in self-determination over communities of color. The predominant strategy in this space has been on community control of land, being given the power that comes with property rights. As you rightfully mentioned, real property rights are steeped in colonialism and whiteness. As we struggle to decolonize society as a whole and in the recognition of this problematic relationship to land, what thoughts or guidance do you have for tackling this tension between displacement of people of color who've historically been denied the right to own land and therefore are vulnerable to persistent displacement, and not perpetuating colonial commodification of land?
That is a great question. And I think that community control of land is a hugely important thing to be working on. And I think that having sort of a decolonial perspective can be tremendously helpful in that project, because what it's saying, or what it can be framed in terms of, is the folks who are on this land, who are claiming to own this land, aren't here legitimately. And if we understand that this land is not rightfully owned by whoever's name is on that piece of paper down at the deeds records office, that sort of opens up great potential. And it means that as we engage in these struggles for community control, we have to be mindful of the fact that, if my community is going to try to keep gentrification from occurring and keep the land here for a poor community of color, making sure that we can all live here where we've been living for however many decades or generations or centuries even, we have to always remember whose land it really is. But looking to that, right, I think it opens up, incredible possibilities, right? We can acknowledge in Atlanta here that we're on Creek land. The Creek Nation isn't saying we have to leave. But if we say, right, this is legitimately Creek land, not legitimately land of the state of Georgia, then, it adds power to our struggles. And I don't have any issue with, trying to make sure that there's more land in the hands of people who are not using it to perpetuate relationships of privilege and exploitation. So I think, it's just a question of being mindful and paying attention to the land. And also, once you start paying attention to the land, a lot of this history can really be appreciated, right? Here, we try to pay attention not only to the fact that it is land from which the creeks were wrongfully removed, but it's land that's soaked in the blood of enslaved Africans, right? That all of the so-called wealth that comes with this land comes from enslaved or otherwise exploited labor. And, that really sort of shifts ways, I think, in which people understand their relationship to the land and their right to be on the land, and it can be very empowering.
Thanks, Natsu. So Audrey Linus asks, do you believe that some form of restorative or transformative justice framework, such as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, would be reparative for this country?
I think truth is extraordinarily important. I think reconciliation can come only after the harm has been rectified. I don't think that reconciliation will come until the truth is really acknowledged and acted upon. And while it's important for us to want to be reconciled with each other, it can't be on the basis of false premises or promises. And so, yes, I think restorative justice is tremendously important. I think many of the ways in which the restorative justice movement has envisioned alternate remedies, alternate penalties for wrongs is really significant. And it helps us get out of this sort of carceral mentality that we have, the mentality that we have that only money can fix things. But at the same time, I think we have to be really careful with the whole notion of reconciliation, because if you look at it, it's usually the people who have benefited from the wrong who want to reconcile before something's being done about it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Natsu. So another question, and this is coming from Linus Herbert, who's at Howard Law, and my apologies if I'm getting your name, the pronunciation of names wrong. And so this question is asking, and starts with an observation. So this person says, I've noticed that Indigenous scholars tend to speak against, pro-immigration or pro-melting pot approaches, and more towards, and I quote here, uber independence or post-oppression that really focuses on reparative goals in an independent context. And this person asks, is uber independence a goal that might serve African Americans better than a long-standing move towards integration?
Yes, that seems like two important areas embodied in that question. One, of course, goes to the question of immigration. And I think that, I'm not sure if the question was saying that Indigenous scholars are opposed to immigration. That was sort of the impression I got. But I think that there's a really big difference between being opposed to immigration and being opposed to the notion that this is a melting pot or a nation of immigrants. I think that those, that analogy, that way of framing what this country is really about is really dangerous and rightfully opposed by many Indigenous scholars. This is not a nation of immigrants, right? That construction entirely wipes out Indigenous people. It wipes out all the people who are involuntarily brought here, and a large sector of people who are only semi-voluntarily brought here. And it's used to try to say that the colonizers have an equal right to everybody else to be here. So I think that that's a really harmful construction. That doesn't mean, however, that immigration is necessarily a bad thing. Especially, there's some great work being done by Christian Carpenter and Angela Riley right now on immigration from Central America. And of course, lots of those folks who are coming are Central American Indigenous peoples. And so we have to look at the whole question of immigration, I think, very differently if we are to respect Indigenous rights here. But it doesn't mean being opposed to immigration in a sort of generic way. It means reconceptualizing it, I think, and reconceptualizing who has the right to say who should be here or not. That was, one of the sort of foundational principles of settler colonial theory, is the notion that the settlers came not just to stay, but to set up a state of their own construction over which they had complete control. They brought with them this prerogative of sovereignty, their own sovereignty. And part of what that meant was they had the right to say who could be here, who couldn't be here, who had to be here. And that's still what we're operating off of now. That notion. And I think that that's a really dangerous one, to give them that power. With respect to independence, we have, of course, historically had a lot of movements for Black independence, a lot of movements for Black ownership and control of land. There's the sort of whole notion of the Black Belt South. There's been movements by the Republic of New Africa and other organizations to, as they put it, free the land, and to set up independent Afro-descendant communities. And I think that those can be very powerful and liberating movements, as long as they have, as they often have been, as long as they're respectful of whose land it is, right? But the notion that people can look to set up independent communities, recognizing whose land they're on, as opposed, legitimately whose land it is, can lead to very powerful alliances and can be quite liberatory. And I don't know where it's going to go, but right now I've read some descriptions of Black folks in Georgia buying up land to create what they're calling a freedom town or freedom city, to be safe from police violence, really. But those kinds of movements, I think, can be very empowering.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to group two questions together that I think are potentially related. So one is from Gay McDougall, who's also on the call. And Gay says, this is coming from someone who was also active in the 60s and 70s. And she says, I was on the group that was trying to follow where the call for decolonization led us. We turned to Africa to see models of decolonization there. I spent time in an Ujamaa village and later in the liberated zones in Mozambique. What we learned was not so helpful. Can you comment on why that search for alternative ways of developing society post-decolonization was void of useful lessons for us? That's Gay's question, and I don't know whether you have an alternative perspective on where previous attempts to kind of follow what decolonization looked like in other parts of the world and how relevant that might be for the US, whether they were helpful examples. And then Daniel Solorzano asks, earlier on, you mentioned that the internal colonial frameworks were important during the 60s and 70s. Can you tell us more why we shifted away from the colonial frame and the decolonial frame and then moved away from it post-70s? So those both seem to have to do with the past and lessons from the past and why trajectories diverged.
Okay, well, Gay McDougall should probably be a featured panelist here. She has so much experience. It's kind of an intimidating question to answer, Gay. But it's a great question. And the truth is that I don't know specifically why some of those models didn't prove to be as helpful as we thought they might be. There's two thoughts I have that come to mind, and I don't know if these are historically accurate portrayals or not. One is that my belief is that in some of those models, like some of the Ujamaa communities, there was an attempt to sort of revitalize the actual traditions of the peoples of those lands and in those communities, and that there were people who still had traditional knowledge, et cetera, to call upon. Now, I understand that thanks to colonialism, a lot of that may have been, eviscerated, but nonetheless, there were sort of organically relevant models to turn to. Now, some of those models, I'm guessing, may not have succeeded as well as we'd hoped in those contexts because of the state pressure in those newly independent states. And that's sort of a whole another issue, right? How, due to sort of the pressures of statism, a lot of peoples remain internally colonized in so-called independent states in Africa and Asia. So that's sort of a separate question. But to the extent that those communities were able to call on extant traditions, I think that there's something really important about models that come from real history and real communities, which are necessarily tied to the land, that are geographically specific. Barbara Mann, who's an Indigenous scholar here, talks about how traditions and understandings and ways of organizing societies and belief systems are necessarily tied to their natural environment, and how you can't necessarily move traditions out of a place to another place, and that sometimes when you do it, it can even be toxic. Now, I'm not saying that was toxic in this particular case, but it's a warning that we have to really pay attention to where we are, what's happening on the land in the environment around us. We can't just sort of go with the Western model of we can take anything and atomize it and recombine the parts and pluck it down somewhere else and it works. So I mean, I'm guessing that might be part of what was happening, was that we were trying to build models here on a basis that was too far removed from their actual roots, either in the culture or in the actual geographic location. But like I said, I'm kind of making that up because I don't know the real history well enough to answer that. And Gay, if you have thoughts on that, I would love to hear them.
We'll see. Maybe Gay will put more into the Q&A with answers of her own. So I'm going to group together.
I'm sorry, I didn't answer the part about why we moved away from the internal colonial framing. And just to wrap it up quickly, I think that partly it's because those movements that were framing things in that way were severely repressed. They were the targets of the most intense COINTELPRO operations and other operations by the U.S. government. Those FBI and other intelligence, et cetera, agency operations moved in to destroy any movements that they saw as threats to the status quo. And I think it tells us a lot that the movements that framed themselves as national liberation movements of one form or another were the ones that were most heavily targeted. That tells us that they were seen as most disruptive of the status quo. And if you turn that framing around, most likely to bring about structural change. And so that's part of it, right? There was incredible repression. And I think people were scared to talk about it that way. But I also think that it's because it was hard to get a hook into the structure when we didn't have an occupying colonial power that clearly had somewhere to go home to. You couldn't just kick them out and declare independence. So I think we sort of ran into a brick wall there because we weren't really thinking about what does it mean to decolonize a settler society as opposed to a sort of more classic colonial society.
Thanks, Natsu. So I'm going to group 3 questions together, and these 3 questions, your response to them may actually bring us to the end of time. Before I do, there's one very quick question about how your book is available, not through Amazon, as in is it possible to get it through other ways?
Go to the NYU website.
Okay.
Get it there.
Okay, so you can get it from the NYU website, to the person who was asking that. So I have 3 questions that I think have variations on using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. The first one comes from Ada Davis Nowry, who says, in Thomas King's novel, The Truth About Stories, he poses the question regarding the barriers to Indigenous legal identification in Canada, questioning, is the right of identity simply a privilege of power? And so Ada's asking, is this true in your experience? How do we keep non-status, non-federally recognized, and other Indigenous folks living in the gray from falling through the cracks? Should the push be for legal identification? And then Tara Duchenne, sorry if I'm saying this wrong, asks, I've been thinking again of Audre Lorde, and I sense that it is true that the master's tools do not dismantle the master's house. So I'm peeling fiber beans now as I listen, picking caterpillars out and not feeling the beans are or should be my property. And I wonder how much energy to put into the master's tools. How do we use legal frameworks to shift emphasis away from the state and legal control by the state over land for a more decolonized relationship with the land itself? And then Yanvi Sobas asks and says, thank you very much for this enlightening and empowering conversation. I have 2 questions. I asked about the Amazon book. The second question was, I'm concerned with the idea of the master's tools, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about attempts to use the pursuit of legal remedies to oppression and the use of wealth and capitalism to obtain ownership as flagships for liberation. i.e., how do we move away from the pursuit of a kind of capitalism of color to truly self-determined and democratically established models of society and community when we are so reliant on capitalism for survival? And Yanvi says, this is all very nebulous in my head, so I'll be happy with any answer you can think of. Thanks again. So those are 3 jam-packed questions, which I think nonetheless are related to each other. And given our time constraints, they may be the ones that we can take before we have to close.
Wow, great questions. Let me just say, I love Thomas King. He is absolutely right at the top of my favorite author list. So I'm so happy that my first questioner brought that up. And it is such, this issue of non-recognized, not federally or state recognized indigenous peoples is really a huge one. And I'm not sure I'm the one best qualified to speak to that, but I will say that I think it's really important for all of us to keep present in our approach to life generally here, that indigenous peoples define themselves, right? That the federal government, the state government, the colonizing entity does not have any right to define them, and we should not be falling into the trap of accepting the definitions of the state. And that's a really dangerous approach. I mean, if you just think about it, right? Like if you think about Cherokee and Creek removal from this part of the country and removal out to Oklahoma and being identified as, quote, Indians at the time of allotment, when white Indian agents were deciding who would go on the rolls to get land, obviously their incentive was to minimize who would be on that land. And they were proceeding in an incredibly arbitrary way. And yet still today, a lot of people are forced to try to trace their ancestry to the Dawes rolls in order to be recognized. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be doing that, because that is part of living under colonial rule at this point in time. But that doesn't mean we have to give those roles legitimacy in some bigger sense. And so I just think any effort we can to support people who might be struggling for recognition because they need that, or who are trying to be, acknowledged for who they are, unrecognized, we really have to support that. And, part of it is there were people who refused to leave, right? Who ran away, who hid, who to some extent had to pass in the communities that they were staying in as either white or black usually, right? In order not to have to leave their homelands. And they're the ones who don't get recognized today. And so, there's just such a complicated history there. In terms of using the master's tools, and that goes to, I think, the question of legal contestations of land and the whole sort of, can we take advantage of capitalism of color, or can we get away from it? I think that at this point, we try to help people get access to and preserve land in whatever ways is necessary, right? We defend the rights of indigenous nations who are being unrecognized or whose land is being taken out of trust if they need it to be put in trust, even though we recognize that, that whole construction is just offensive. Nonetheless, if that will help them stay on their land and help them preserve the land, we have to do that. I mean, we also have an incredible environmental crisis going on right now, right? So any way in which we can preserve and protect land, I think, is important. And so we use whatever tools we have to do that, because the land is still going to be here when we're long past this era in human history. And so, we have to do what we can to try to protect all of our relatives in that sense. And we don't have to acknowledge the legitimacy of the system in order to, in that sense, participate in it, right? I mean, we don't think it's okay for so many people to be incarcerated, but we're still going to go down and bail people out of jail because, we have to use that system to get them out. And I sort of feel the same way about land, right? We're trying to bail the land out of jail here, and we do it however we can. And, in general, I feel that way about the law, right? We recognize the reality, going back to Derek Bell, where we started, right? We can't imagine away colonialism. We have to be realistic. And so we deal with what where we are. We use whatever tools we can, but that doesn't mean that we say that they're legitimate. And I think that might just about bring us to the end of our time.
I know, and there's some other really interesting questions in the Q&A. So I want to apologize for those of our participants whose questions we weren't able to get to, but thank you for sending them anyway. And we'll share them with Natsu so she knows how you're thinking about her interventions as well. But it just remains for me to thank you, Natsu, for joining us and for being so open to the many questions that we had, which I think were really interesting and across the board covered many issues that you raised in the book. Again, for those of you who haven't read the book, strongly encourage you to get your hands on a copy, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law. Thank you so much, Natsu.
And thank you so much for this opportunity. It's great to get to talk with you again. And thank you all out there for those amazing questions. I really wish we had more time. And I wish I could hear back from you all, because it sounds like you're doing lots of really wonderful, amazing things and thinking interesting thoughts and have some great experiences that I would love to learn more about. I'm sorry that we don't have that human connection right now, but thank you for attending and for contributing.
Thanks, Natsu. And Jasleen, thank you so much for making all of this happen. We couldn't have done this without you. So thanks to Jasleen and to the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law School.
Yes,
Bye.
absolutely. Bye-bye.